I'm Tina Fordham, and you're watching The Navigator. The Navigator is a new collaboration between Fordham Global Foresight and the London Stock Exchange Group, where we look at geopolitical strategy for C-suite leaders, the global forces and events most likely to impact the business and investment environment. Well, it's impossible to start this conversation without acknowledging the recent tragic events in the Middle East, which came as an enormous shock, especially given that diplomatic relations in the region had been on an improving trend, and the last time there were significant tensions from a geopolitical and market perspective was as far back as 2006. But the current Middle East turmoil isn't happening in isolation. The Hamas attacks and the expected Israeli retaliation compound the already heightened geopolitical volatility that followed the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and take place against the backdrop of growing concerns about a U.S. hard landing and the continued battle by central banks to bring down inflation. So the current constellation of risks is more than bad luck or bad leaders, although neither helps. In terms of how we think about it, I don't think it's particularly useful to try to characterize it as a new Cold War or a new hot war either. Instead, we've entered what I call a new geopolitical risk supercycle, a term I've borrowed from astronomy that refers to expansion. What this means in practice is that the drivers of geopolitical risk, like income and health inequality, resource scarcity, corruption, and poor governance, have all strengthened, and this is over a period of years, whilst the traditional buffers that had helped to mitigate these risks in the past, especially central bank liquidity, public trust, institutions, and international cooperation, have all weakened. That's the bad news, and that is also why we think this volatility is likely to continue for some time and to move to center stage. So if you're running a company, do you need to really worry about geopolitics on top of all the other things that you're worried about? This certainly wasn't the case in the past, but here's why geopolitics matter. If you're worried about interest rates staying higher for longer, oil prices, supply chains, business continuity, reputational risk, ESG and DE&I efforts, and meeting your revenue targets, sharpening your grasp of geopolitics has become crucial. This doesn't mean you need to become an expert on geopolitics. You'll be relieved to know. You have heard perhaps of EQ in management parlance, and I'm going to tell you how to raise your PQ, your political quotient, as a way of dealing with this increase in geopolitical risk. So to start out with, a key element in raising your PQ is reframing your understanding of what geopolitics is. Geopolitics is not news and current affairs, it's about power dynamics. And instead of thinking in terms of country risk in silos, 21st century geopolitical risk is about examining the interlinkages between leaders, citizens, markets, the economy, and especially the rule of law, or in some cases, the lack of it. So let's look at what's in focus this month on our watch list on our Navigator radar. So each month, we'll create a relative ranking of the top global risks, taking into consideration their potential for regional or systemic impact and market or economic shocks. This month, the top of the list, we have the Israel-Hamas war, which in our view has the potential to escalate into a regional conflict and possibly an international conflict. And when that happens, that's when you have a transmission mechanism to take a local conflict to something that's systemic. Here, our view started out as being out of consensus, but I think markets are coming around to the potential and have been underestimating the potential for internationalization. That means expanding the conflict to include Hezbollah and of greatest concern to Iran. When it comes to the buffers we talked about that can help mitigate risks, of course, diplomats in Washington are working with allies in the Middle East and the Gulf to prevent the internationalization and expansion of the conflict. But another byproduct of the end of what we call the Pax Americana and middle powers increasingly acting independently in their own national self-interests is greater unpredictability. And that's where difficulty in predicting the nature of responses by the different actors, whether it's Hamas, Israel, or others like Iran, comes into play. Next, we have the conflict in Ukraine happening for over 18 months now. There are really no efforts toward a diplomatic resolution in sight, and we are heading into a second winter without an agreement with Russia on food security or energy. Meanwhile, the Kremlin looks at the conflict in Israel as well as the disruption in the US House of Representatives, where there still is no speaker following the ouster earlier this week, as distractions that will ideally for Moscow keep Washington busy and less engaged in the war in Ukraine. And bear in mind that with no speaker in the US House of Representatives, no new aid for Israel or Ukraine can be approved. I want to close on another theme on our radar for the second half of the year and as we head into 2024, and that's elections in some of the biggest democracies in the world. We all know about the US, where Trump and Biden are likely to face off again. We also have the UK, the European Parliament, India, Mexico, South Africa, as well as some very geostrategic countries like Taiwan, Russia, and Ukraine. There's a lot more to say. We're out of time for today, but to keep in touch with our views, sign up on our website to receive our private newsletter and send us your questions for next time.